They built the largest battleship in history, a floating fortress with guns that could hurl shells the weight of small cars over 20 miles. The Imperial Japanese Navy called it Yamato, named after the ancient province and poetic term for Japan itself. They believed it unsinkable, unmatched, the ultimate expression of naval power. Yet on April 7, 1945, this leviathan of steel met its fate without ever firing its massive 18-inch guns against an American battleship. The submarines didn't even fire a single torpedo to sink it. This is the story of hubris and miscalculation, of a weapon designed for a war that never happened, and how the mightiest warship ever built became victim not to enemy guns, but to something far more devastating: strategic irrelevance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Yamato story begins not with its sinking but with confidence born from centuries of tradition. The Japanese decision to build super-battleships was no accident of design or whim of admirals. It was the product of careful naval planning that began in the 1920s, when Japanese naval strategists recognized what they saw as their nation's existential dilemma. Japan, an island nation dependent on imports for survival, needed to control the seas around it, yet faced potential adversaries with far greater industrial capacity. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed a 5-to-3 ratio of capital ships between the United States and Japan. Japanese naval planners accepted these limitations publicly, while privately seeking ways to overcome what they viewed as an intolerable disadvantage. If Japan could not match American numbers, they reasoned, perhaps they could create ships of such overwhelming individual power that quantity would matter less than quality. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though later skeptical of battleship supremacy, initially supported the concept. "If we cannot build many ships," he reportedly said in a naval staff meeting, "then we must build ships that are individually superior to any the Americans possess." This philosophy gave birth to a design study in 1934 for what would become the Yamato-class vessels displacing over 60,000 tons, nearly twice the size of American battleships of the era. Engineer Keiji Fukuda led the design team that took on this unprecedented challenge. His most notable innovation was the main battery 9 18-inch guns housed in 3 massive turrets. Each gun could fire shells weighing over 3,000 pounds to a range exceeding 25 miles. No battleship in history had ever mounted weapons of this caliber. The guns were so massive that special manufacturing facilities had to be constructed just to forge their barrels. The armor scheme was equally ambitious. The main belt armor, along the waterline, measured 16 inches thick, angled to increase effective protection. The turrets had 25 inches of front armor. The conning tower, from which the ship would be commanded in battle, was protected by nearly 20 inches of steel plate. Critical machinery spaces were shielded by multiple armored decks designed to defeat bombs and plunging shellfire. Protection extended beyond mere armor thickness. The Yamato incorporated over 1,000 watertight compartments. Its underwater protection system, designed to withstand torpedo hits, extended nearly 20 feet from the hull's interior to its outer edge. Engineers calculated that the ship could absorb multiple torpedo strikes and remain combat effective, a claim that would later be tested under the most severe conditions imaginable. The vessel that emerged from these designs was of staggering proportions. At 862 feet long, with a beam of 121 feet, Yamato would displace 72,000 tons fully loaded, 60% larger than the American Iowa-class battleships. Its power plant delivered 150,000 horsepower through 4 propeller shafts, driving the massive vessel at a respectable 27 knots. Construction began in utmost secrecy. On November 4, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal, workers laid the keel for hull number 111, the ship's identity concealed even from most of those building it. Extraordinary security measures surrounded the project. Special bamboo screens shielded the construction site from observation. Workers were compartmentalized, each knowing only their specific tasks. Aerial photography was prohibited over the shipyard. The Japanese government understood that if Americans learned of these ships' true size and armament, it would trigger a new naval arms race they could not win. The actual assembly of such an enormous vessel presented unprecedented engineering challenges. The dry dock had to be specially expanded. New cranes had to be built. The largest naval guns ever created had to be manufactured in dedicated facilities, then transported and installed with precision. Japan's entire industrial base strained to produce the special steel alloys required for armor plate and structural components. Yamato's construction consumed resources at an astonishing rate. The steel used in this single vessel could have built dozens of destroyers or hundreds of aircraft. Its fuel consumption, a staggering 27 feet per gallon, would strain Japan's limited oil reserves. But these practical concerns were secondary to the ship's symbolic importance. Yamato would be the material embodiment of Japan's vision of itself as the dominant naval power in the Pacific. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Yamato was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its sister ship Musashi would follow in August 1942. A third vessel of the class, Shinano, was later converted to an aircraft carrier, while still under construction, a telling sign of shifting naval priorities that the battleship admirals chose to ignore. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto transferred his flag to Yamato in February 1942. Making the super-battleship the flagship of the combined fleet. From its bridge, he would direct the opening phases of Japan's Pacific offensive, a campaign of stunning initial success that seemed to vindicate Japanese strategic thinking. Yet, Yamamoto, more than any other Japanese leader, harbored doubts about the war's long-term prospects. "I can run wild for 6 months or a year," he had warned government officials before hostilities began, "but after that, I have no expectation of success." As Yamato steamed majestically through Japanese waters, its very size and power creating a visible wake of national pride, another type of naval vessel was proving far more decisive in the Pacific War. The aircraft carrier, with its ability to project power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, was rendering the battleship strategically obsolete with each passing month. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 delivered a crippling blow to Japan's carrier force, sinking 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement. Throughout this pivotal battle, Yamato remained far from the action, its mighty guns silent, its presence irrelevant to the outcome. The Emperor's ship, built at such enormous cost to dominate surface engagements, found itself sidelined in a war increasingly fought by aircraft beyond visual range. Naval warfare had evolved faster than battleship doctrine. The decisive battle between opposing battle lines, the scenario for which Yamato had been designed, never materialized. Instead, American submarines began an inexorable campaign against Japanese shipping, while carrier aircraft struck targets far beyond the range of even Yamato's massive guns. For much of 1942 and 1943, Yamato operated primarily as a mobile headquarters and fleet flagship, its combat operations limited by fuel concerns and a growing recognition of its vulnerability to air attack. When it did venture into contested waters, the results were troubling for battleship advocates. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Yamato was targeted by American carrier aircraft. Despite its formidable anti-aircraft armament, which by this stage of the war included dozens of 25mm guns, it could not adequately defend itself against determined air attack. Only poor weather and the priority given to striking Japanese carriers saved Yamato from serious damage. The Leyte Gulf campaign in October 1944 finally brought Yamato into direct combat operations. As part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the super-battleship sailed into the Sibyun Sea on October 24, headed for the American landing beaches on Leyte. Here it experienced the full fury of modern naval warfare. American scout planes spotted Kurita's force early on October 24th. Within hours, waves of carrier aircraft descended on the Japanese formation. Yamato became a primary target, its enormous bulk impossible to conceal. Despite radical maneuvering, the massive vessel heeling over as it executed emergency turns, Yamato was struck by 2 bombs and a torpedo. The underwater protection system that engineers had designed with such confidence was put to its first real test. The torpedo struck the port side, causing flooding that the damage control teams struggled to contain. The ship took on a 7-degree list before counter-flooding stabilized it. The damage was not crippling, but it demonstrated Yamato's fundamental vulnerability to weapons that cost a tiny fraction of what had been invested in the battleship. More significantly, the air attacks sank the battleship Musashi Yamato's sister ship, and its equal in size and protection. Musashi absorbed an astonishing 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits before finally capsizing, a testament to the design's toughness, but also to the futility of such passive resistance against modern weapons. A single fleet carrier could launch enough aircraft to overwhelm any surface ship, no matter how well armored. Despite these losses, Kurita's force pressed on, and on the morning of October 25th, Yamato found itself in the one situation for which it had been designed: surface action against American ships. Off the island of Samar, Kurita's powerful force encountered a small American task group designated Taffy 36, escort carriers protected by 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. For the first and only time in its career, Yamato fired its main batteries in anger against enemy surface ships. The enormous 18-inch guns roared to life, hurling shells weighing as much as a compact car toward the American vessels. The psychological impact was significant. American sailors reported geysers from near misses that towered higher than their masts. Yet even in this seemingly ideal scenario, Yamato's performance revealed the limitations of the battleship concept. Despite its overwhelming firepower advantage, Yamato alone outweighed the entire American force. The results were disappointing. Japanese fire control systems, designed for engagement of capital ships at long ranges, struggled to track the small, agile American vessels maneuvering at high speed. Most of Yamato's massive shells missed their targets entirely. More embarrassingly, when American destroyers pressed home torpedo attacks against the Japanese formation, Yamato was forced to make a radical turn to avoid their torpedoes, a maneuver that took it out of the battle entirely for a crucial period. The ship that was supposed to dominate surface engagements found itself retreating from vessels a fraction of its size. After Leyte Gulf, the strategic situation for Japan deteriorated rapidly. American forces advanced inexorably toward the home islands. Resources became increasingly scarce. Oil shortages kept major fleet units confined to harbor for long periods, their crews drilling endlessly for battles that never came. By early 1945, Japan faced an increasingly desperate situation. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and were preparing to invade Okinawa, just 350 miles from the southern Japanese home island of Kyushu. Imperial Navy planners, searching for ways to repel the invasion, developed Operation Tengo, a virtual suicide mission for the remaining surface fleet. The plan was stunning in its fatalism. Yamato, accompanied only by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa Beach, itself near the American landing beaches, and fight until destroyed using its massive guns as shore batteries. With only enough fuel for a one-way journey, the mission amounted to a naval version of the kamikaze attacks being launched by Japanese aircraft. On April 1, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa. 5 days later, on April 6th, Yamato received its final orders. That afternoon, the massive battleship weighed anchor and departed Tokuyama. As it steamed south through the inland sea, crewmen lined the decks of other vessels to watch it pass. Many knew they were witnessing Yamato's final voyage. The mood aboard the battleship was somber yet resolved. Captain Kosaku Aruga addressed the crew, explaining their mission without euphemism. They were sailing to Okinawa to engage American forces at point-blank range, and they would not return. Extra rations, including sake, were issued. Many crewmen wrote final letters home. Some tied hachimaki headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans. The ship's young officers gathered in the wardroom for a quiet celebration, drinking toasts with sake cups that would never return to their holders on the bulkhead. Meanwhile, American submarines Threadfin and Hackleback spotted the Japanese force almost immediately after it sortied. They shadowed Yamato through the night, transmitting position reports but never firing torpedoes, a strategic decision that would prove wise. American commanders, receiving these reports, began marshalling a massive airstrike. The battleship that had been built to decide the Pacific War in a single day of surface combat would instead face an enemy that could attack from beyond the horizon without ever bringing a ship within range of Yamato's guns. As dawn broke on April 7th, the Japanese force continued southward under heavy cloud cover that offered temporary protection from air attack. By mid-morning, the weather began to clear. At 10:32, Yamato's radar operators reported contacts at nearly 80 miles, the first wave of American aircraft approaching from the carriers of Task Force 58. The American strike force was overwhelming 280 aircraft in the first wave alone, with a second wave of identical size already launching. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters from 8 different carriers converged on Yamato, with a coordination that demonstrated the maturity of American carrier operations. At 12:20 in the afternoon, the first American aircraft appeared visually above the Japanese formation. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries, now numbering over 150 guns of various calibers, opened fire, filling the sky with flak. The battleship began evasive maneuvers, its rudder hard over, creating a massive wake as it twisted to avoid the coming attacks. But against such numbers, evasion was futile. The American attack followed classic anti-shipping doctrine. Fighters suppressed the Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while bombers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the defenders to divide their attention. Torpedo bombers approached from both port and starboard sides, making it impossible for Yamato to turn away from all threats. The first bomb hit at 12:41, striking near the bridge. Moments later, torpedoes began finding their mark along the port side. Yamato's damage control teams responded with trained efficiency, but they faced an impossible task. More torpedoes struck the starboard side, negating the counterflooding measures taken to compensate for port-side damage. By 1:30, Yamato had taken multiple torpedo hits on both sides of its hull. The elaborate torpedo defense system, so carefully designed to absorb underwater explosions, was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Progressive flooding caused the ship to list increasingly to port. Power failures began affecting various sections of the vessel as water reached electrical systems. At 1:33, a torpedo struck near the engine rooms, causing catastrophic flooding in the engineering spaces. Yamato began to lose propulsive power, its speed dropping. This made it an even easier target for the second wave of American aircraft now arriving overhead. By 1:45, the port list had increased to 15 degrees and was growing steadily worse. Captain Aruga ordered counterflooding of starboard compartments, but damage control parties reported that many starboard voids were already at maximum capacity. With the list continuing to increase and the ship settling by the bow, senior officers recognized that the end was near. At 2:23 in the afternoon, Captain Aruga gave the order to abandon ship. By this time, the list had increased to an unsurvivable degree. As crewmen tried to escape the doomed vessel, a massive explosion tore through the forward magazines. Whether this was caused by American bombs or by Japanese officers destroying the ship to prevent capture remains, but debated by historians. The explosion that followed was visible from Kyushu, over 200 miles away, a mushroom cloud that rose 6 miles into the sky. Yamato broke apart and sank rapidly, taking with it over 3,000 of its 3,300 crew, including Captain Aruga and most senior officers. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. The remaining Japanese vessels rescued survivors before returning to port. The final engagement had lasted just under 2 hours. In that time, American aircraft had hit Yamato with at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. The ship designed to dominate surface engagements had been destroyed without a single American vessel coming within range of its massive guns. The submarines that had first spotted Yamato never fired a torpedo. They simply reported its position and let carrier aircraft do the rest. The sinking of Yamato represented more than the loss of a single warship, no matter how impressive its specifications. It symbolized the end of an era in naval warfare and the conclusive demonstration that no amount of armor could protect a surface vessel from determined air attack. The age of the battleship, a period that had dominated naval thinking for nearly a century, was over. For the Japanese nation, Yamato's loss carried even deeper significance. The ship had been conceived as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power and national pride, a vessel so powerful it could offset America's industrial advantage. Its destruction seemed to confirm what many already feared. Japan could not win this war. Less than 4 months later, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered unconditionally. In the years after the war, the story of Yamato became part of Japan's national narrative of suffering and resilience. Films, books, and eventually anime series portrayed the ship and its final mission in increasingly mythologized terms. Yamato transformed from a failed weapons system into a symbol of tragic sacrifice, Japanese sailors knowingly sailing to their deaths out of duty to their nation. For naval strategists worldwide, the lessons were more practical. Resources invested in Yamato and its sister ships enough steel, machinery, and ordnance to have built dozens of smaller vessels or hundreds of aircraft had yielded minimal strategic return. The ships that Japanese leaders had believed would win the decisive battle had instead been reduced to elaborate targets, unable to influence the war's outcome in any meaningful way. The submarines that shadowed Yamato to its doom represented the future of naval warfare, stealthy, patient, and lethal. They chose not to attack directly, but their role was crucial nonetheless. By simply reporting Yamato's position, they enabled its destruction through networked warfare, multiple platforms, sharing information to deliver overwhelming force precisely where needed. Today, maritime historians view the Yamato as both technological marvel and strategic anachronism, the pinnacle of a weapon system that was already obsolete when its keel was laid. Its 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, fired in anger exactly once, with minimal effect. Its armor scheme, though innovative, proved inadequate against the weapons of 1945. Its very existence represented a fundamental misreading of how naval warfare would evolve in the age of aircraft. Yet there remains something compelling about Yamato's story, a certain tragedy in the image of the world's largest battleship, steaming resolutely toward certain destruction, its crew knowing they would not return. There is both folly and nobility in that final voyage, a nation clinging to outdated concepts of honor, even as modern warfare rendered them obsolete. The legacy of Yamato extends far beyond its watery grave. In the decades following the war, oceanographers and maritime historians sought to locate the battleship's final resting place. It wasn't until 1985 that a team led by American shipwreck hunter Robert Ballard, using advanced sonar technology, finally pinpointed the wreckage. The mighty vessel lies in pieces at a depth of 1,500 feet, its hull broken, its massive gun turrets scattered across the seabed like fallen monuments. Underwater photography revealed the haunting reality of Yamato's destruction. The ship that was designed to withstand tremendous punishment had literally been torn apart by internal explosions. Steel plates 15 inches thick were peeled back like paper. Armored turrets weighing thousands of tons had been hurled hundreds of feet from the hull. The damage pattern confirmed what survivors had reported: catastrophic magazine detonations that tore the vessel apart from within. For Japanese citizens who viewed these images decades after the war, the emotional impact was profound. Many wept openly. Yamato had become more than a warship in the Japanese cultural imagination. It represented both the hubris that led to war and the suffering that resulted. Writers, filmmakers, and artists incorporated Yamato into a broader narrative about Japan's wartime experience and post-war transformation. The naval officers who had championed Yamato's construction faced their own reckonings after the war. Many of the battleship admirals who had dominated Imperial Navy planning were discredited. Some faced war crimes trials. Others retreated into private life, rarely speaking of their roles. A few wrote memoirs attempting to justify decisions that, in hindsight, appeared tragically misguided. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded Yamato during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, lived until 1977. In his later years, he became a Buddhist priest, seeking spiritual redemption for the men lost under his command. When interviewed about Yamato's final mission, he responded with a single sentence: "It was a foolish operation indeed, but we had no choice." Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which had built much of Yamato's complex machinery, transformed itself after the war. The company that had once produced the world's most powerful warships turned its engineering expertise to peaceful pursuits: commercial shipbuilding, automotive manufacturing, and aerospace. This conversion from military to civilian production mirrored Japan's broader post-war reinvention. The American naval officers who had ordered Yamato's destruction also reflected on its significance. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the Fifth Fleet during the final stages of the Pacific War, later told historians, "The sinking of Yamato represented not just the destruction of a ship, but the end of a naval era. We all knew battleships were finished, but seeing something that size destroyed so completely by aircraft alone drove the point home with finality." Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was more succinct. When informed of Yamato's destruction, he reportedly said, "Well, that's that." The brevity of his response reflected the professional assessment that by 1945, battleships had become strategic irrelevancies. Their destruction, while satisfying from a military perspective, changed little in the war's overall trajectory. For the submarine crews who had first detected Yamato's final sortie, there was a certain irony in their role. Submarines represented the future of naval warfare, stealthy, patient platforms that could project power with minimal risk. Yet, in this instance, they had deliberately foregone the opportunity to attack, recognizing that aircraft could accomplish the mission more efficiently. Commander James W. Blanchard of USS Threadfin later explained the decision. "We could have attempted a torpedo attack, but the risk-reward calculation didn't justify it." Yamato was heavily escorted, making a successful approach difficult. By reporting its position and letting the carriers handle it, we achieved the objective without unnecessarily risking my boat and crew. This cold strategic calculus exemplified the evolution of American naval thinking by the war's end. The aircraft that actually sank Yamato came from 8 different carriers of Task Force 58, reflecting the distributed nature of modern naval power. Pilots who participated in the attack described a scene of awesome destruction. The massive battleship, twisting desperately to avoid torpedoes, its anti-aircraft batteries firing futilely at swarms of attackers approaching from all directions. Lieutenant Clinton Watkins, flying a Hellcat fighter from USS Bennington, recalled, "I'd never seen anything that big, even from altitude. It was like an island with guns. But size didn't save it. Nothing could have against that many aircraft. When it finally went up, the explosion was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed, like someone had set off an atomic bomb at sea." Lieutenant Joseph Carmichael, piloting a Helldiver dive bomber from USS Yorktown, provided a different perspective. "What struck me was the waste of it all. This magnificent ship, this testament to human engineering skill, reduced to scrap in 2 hours. We were doing our job, and they were doing theirs, but you couldn't help feeling that something important was being lost, not just a ship, but a way of thinking about naval warfare that stretched back centuries." For the few Japanese sailors who survived Yamato's sinking men, rescued from the oil-slicked waters by remaining destroyers, the experience was transformative. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, who published a memoir titled Requiem for Battleship Yamato in 1952, described his emotions as he swam away from the sinking vessel. As I watched Yamato disappear, I felt as though I was witnessing the end of Japan itself, not just our navy or our war effort, but everything we had believed about our place in the world. Yoshida's account captured something essential about Yamato's significance. The ship had embodied Japan's vision of itself as a great power, technologically advanced, strategically formidable, worthy of international respect. Its destruction forced a fundamental reassessment of national identity. What would Japan become, if not a military power? How would it relate to the world, if not through force? These questions would define Japan's post-war development. Under American occupation from 1945 to 1952, the nation adopted a constitution renouncing war as a sovereign right. Its military was reconstituted as self-defense forces, legally restricted from offensive operations. Its economy was redirected from military production toward consumer goods and exports. In perhaps the most profound irony, the nation that had built Yamato, the ultimate expression of naval firepower, became a global advocate for nuclear disarmament and military restraint. The transformation was not immediate or without contradiction, but the trajectory was clear. Japan would seek security and international standing through economic rather than military means. The United States, meanwhile, absorbed different lessons from Yamato's fate. American naval planners recognized the battleship's obsolescence, but remained committed to carrier aviation as the primary means of projecting naval power. The massive fleet carriers that had launched the aircraft against Yamato would evolve into the nuclear-powered supercarriers that form the backbone of American naval strategy to this day. Yet, even as carriers replaced battleships as capital ships, elements of the battleship philosophy persisted. The desire for invulnerability through armor gave way to concepts of virtual armor, defending high-value platforms through layers of sensors, interceptor aircraft, escort vessels, and increasingly sophisticated missile defense systems. The core concept remained the same, creating platforms that could project power while resisting enemy attacks. The submarines that had tracked Yamato without engaging directly represented another evolutionary path. In the post-war era, submarines would transition from primarily anti-shipping platforms to strategic weapons systems carrying nuclear missiles. Their defining characteristics, stealth, patience, and lethal precision, would become increasingly central to naval strategy. By the 1960s, American ballistic missile submarines carried more destructive power than the entire combined fleets of World War II. A single Ohio-class submarine commissioned in the 1980s could deploy 24 Trident missiles, each carrying multiple nuclear warheads enough firepower to devastate an entire nation. This extraordinary concentration of destructive capability in vessels designed to remain unseen represented the ultimate repudiation of Yamato's philosophy of visible power projection. The industrial capacities that had enabled these naval revolutions told their own story about the war's aftermath. American shipyards that had produced warships at unprecedented rates during the conflict converted to commercial production without missing a beat. The manufacturing expertise developed during the war years propelled decades of economic expansion. Japanese shipbuilding, devastated by wartime destruction and post-war restrictions, underwent its own remarkable revival. By the 1960s, Japanese yards had become the world's most efficient producers of commercial vessels. Companies that had once built warships like Yamato now constructed container ships, tankers, and cruise liners that connected the global economy. This parallel renaissance reflected deeper convergences between former enemies. Both nations channeled their industrial and technological capabilities toward commercial rather than military ends. Both embraced international trade as a pathway to prosperity and influence. Both recognized that in the post-war world, economic power had become more significant than military might. Yet for those who had experienced Yamato's brief career firsthand, these broader historical patterns could not fully capture the human dimensions of the story. Kazuhiro Fukuda, who served as a junior engineering officer aboard Yamato and survived its sinking, spent decades struggling with what he described as the meaninglessness of our sacrifice. In an interview conducted in 1997, shortly before his death, Fukuda reflected, "We were told we were sailing to save Japan. We believed our deaths would serve some purpose. But when I look back now, I see that nothing we did could have changed the outcome. The war was already lost. Our leaders knew this, yet they sent us to die anyway. This is the hardest thing to accept, not that we were defeated, but that our sacrifice was unnecessary." Fukuda's painful recognition echoed beyond Yamato to encompass the broader tragedy of the Pacific War. By 1945, Japan's strategic position was hopeless. Its merchant fleet had been decimated by submarine warfare. Its industrial centers were being systematically destroyed by B-29 bombing raids. Its population faced increasing hardship and privation. Yet, its leadership continued to demand sacrifices in pursuit of increasingly illusory victory scenarios. American casualties in the Pacific War exceeded 100,000 dead and wounded. Japanese military deaths approached 2 million. Civilian casualties in territories affected by the conflict numbered in the millions more. Set against this immense human cost, the technical specifications of warships, their displacement tonnage, gun caliber, armor thickness, seem almost obscenely trivial. Yet Yamato's story remains compelling precisely because it encapsulates larger truths about the conflict. The ship embodied both the technical brilliance and the strategic blindness that characterized Japan's war effort. It represented tremendous resources allocated according to outdated doctrines. It symbolized courage and sacrifice in service of misguided objectives. For naval historians and military strategists, Yamato offers enduring lessons about adaptation and obsolescence. No weapon system, however impressive, can remain relevant if it fails to evolve with changing conditions. No doctrine, however historically validated, can survive contact with technological revolution. The battleship admirals who dominated Japanese naval planning had built their careers in a world where surface gunnery determined naval supremacy. They continued believing in that world even as aviation and submarines fundamentally changed the character of maritime warfare. This failure of imagination was not unique to Imperial Japan. Military organizations worldwide struggle with similar challenges, balancing institutional tradition against emerging threats, allocating limited resources across competing priorities, distinguishing between genuine innovation and fleeting trends. Yamato's fate remains relevant to modern defense planners, precisely because the dynamics that rendered it obsolete continue to operate in contemporary weapon system development. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Yamato's story lies in what the ship represented to ordinary Japanese sailors who served aboard it. For them, the battleship was not primarily a strategic asset or a symbol of national pride. It was their home, their duty station, their daily reality. They maintained its complex machinery, polished its brass fittings, cleaned its decks, and trained endlessly for the decisive battle that never materialized as they imagined it. Mitsuo Yamaguchi, who served as a turret operator on Yamato's No. 2 main battery, described the disconnect between the ship's symbolic importance and the sailor's perspective. To the admirals, Yamato was Japan's ultimate weapon. To politicians, it was our national pride. But to us, who lived and worked aboard her, she was simply our ship. We took pride in keeping her ready, in doing our jobs well. The grand strategy was not our concern. We trusted our leaders to employ us wisely. That trust proved tragically misplaced. The leaders who ordered Yamato's final mission knew it had no chance of success, no possibility of reaching Okinawa and effecting the battle there. Internal Navy documents recovered after the war reveal that the operation was conceived primarily as a gesture, a demonstration that the Imperial Navy was willing to sacrifice everything rather than surrender. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who as Chief of the Naval General Staff authorized Operation Tengo, later testified at the Tokyo War Crimes trials. "We were fully aware that the mission had little chance of military success. But at that stage of the war, the moral example of Yamato's sacrifice seemed more important than practical considerations. We believed it might inspire greater resistance among our forces and perhaps influence the American willingness to accept a negotiated peace." This rationalization, sacrificing thousands of sailors for symbolic effect, reflected the moral bankruptcy of Japan's wartime leadership by 1945. Having initiated a war they could not win, they continued demanding sacrifices long after any reasonable hope of victory had vanished. Yamato's final mission represented not strategic calculation, but desperation clothed in the language of honor and duty. For American forces who witnessed Yamato's destruction, the experience prompted different reflections. Many expressed admiration for the Japanese sailors' courage, while questioning the leadership that had sent them on such a hopeless mission. Commander David McCampbell, a naval aviator who coordinated part of the airstrike, later wrote, "Those men fought their ship with everything they had right to the end. You couldn't help respecting their determination. But the whole operation made no sense militarily. It was just a waste of a fine ship and brave men." This sentiment, respect for individual courage coupled with condemnation of the leadership that misused it, characterized many American assessments of Japan's final military efforts. The kamikaze pilots who crashed their aircraft into American vessels, the soldiers who fought suicidal last stands on Pacific Islands, the sailors who died aboard Yamato all displayed a level of commitment that Americans found both impressive and disturbing. After the war, as former enemies became allies in the new Cold War international order, these complex emotions evolved into something approaching mutual understanding. Veterans from both sides began meeting in reconciliation gatherings. Japanese and American naval officers exchanged professional visits and studied each other's wartime experiences. The children and grandchildren of those who had fought visited memorials together. Today, naval museums in both countries display models and artifacts from Yamato. Documentaries explore its construction, service history, and destruction. Computer simulations recreate the massive vessel in digital form, allowing new generations to experience something of its scale and power. The battleship that was meant to be unsinkable, undefeatable, the material embodiment of Japanese naval supremacy, has become instead a shared historical reference point, a catalyst for reflection rather than a cause for division. In this transformation lies perhaps the most meaningful legacy of Yamato and the war it epitomized. The conflict that began with imperial ambition and nationalist fervor ultimately produced a post-war order based on economic integration and shared prosperity. The nations that had committed unprecedented resources to destroying each other became partners in building a more interconnected world. Neither the Japanese officers who conceived Yamato as the ultimate expression of naval power, nor the American leaders who ordered its destruction could have imagined the world. Their actions would help create a global system, where aircraft carriers serve primarily as platforms for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, where former enemies conduct joint naval exercises, where the greatest threats to maritime security come not from rival fleets, but from non-state actors and environmental challenges. This unexpected evolution offers both hope and caution. Hope that even the most bitter conflicts can give way to cooperation and mutual respect. Caution that technological superiority provides no guarantee of strategic wisdom, that courage and sacrifice can be misused in service of flawed objectives, that military power divorced from ethical foundation and realistic assessment leads inevitably to tragedy. Yamato's story echoes beyond its specific historical context to illuminate broader patterns in human affairs. It reminds us that nations, like individuals, can become dangerously committed to outdated conceptions of themselves. It demonstrates how institutions resist evidence that contradicts their core beliefs. It illustrates how sunk costs, both literal and figurative, can distort decision-making. And perhaps most importantly, it shows how even the most powerful weapons ultimately prove inadequate when deployed in service of fundamentally unsustainable strategic positions. The massive 18-inch guns that were meant to decide the fate of nations never had the chance to fulfill their designed purpose. The ship that represented the pinnacle of battleship evolution became instead a symbol of an entire category of warships rendered obsolete by technological change. The nation that invested so much of its limited industrial capacity in creating the world's largest battleship would find its post-war security and prosperity through entirely different means. In this irony lies the final lesson of Yamato, that strength comes not from size or firepower alone, but from adaptability, from willingness to reassess fundamental assumptions, from courage to change course when existing paths lead toward destruction. The true legacy of the mighty battleship may be the understanding that no weapon, however powerful, can compensate for strategic misconception, and that no nation's future is well served by clinging to outdated visions of its past. The true magnitude of Yamato's failure became apparent only in the cold light of historical analysis. 4 years of war, millions of lives, and unprecedented expenditure of national resources had achieved nothing but defeat. The ship that embodied Japan's naval ambitions lay shattered on the ocean floor, its destruction merely a footnote in the larger narrative of American victory. But within this apparent futility lay deeper truths about technological hubris, strategic miscalculation, and the human capacity for both self-deception and eventual reconciliation. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the officers who had championed Yamato's construction faced a moment of profound reckoning. Admiral Kiyoshi Hasegawa, who had supervised the battleship's design phase as head of the Naval Technical Department, retreated into seclusion at his country home outside Kure. For 3 days, he neither ate nor slept, sitting alone in contemplation of what had been lost. On the 4th day, he emerged and wrote a single sentence in his journal: "We built magnificent ships for a war that could only be won by invisible ones." This belated insight captured the fundamental paradox of Japan's naval strategy. The nation had invested its limited industrial capacity in visible symbols of power, massive battleships, heavy cruisers, prestigious aircraft carriers, while America had pursued a more balanced approach, building not only surface combatants, but also the submarine fleet that would eventually strangle Japan's maritime commerce and the logistics network that would sustain operations across the vast Pacific. The sinking of the Japanese merchant fleet, not the destruction of its battleships, ultimately decided the Pacific War. American submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness after early torpedo problems were resolved, methodically dismantled Japan's maritime transportation system. By 1945, over 60% of Japan's merchant shipping had been destroyed. Raw materials could not reach factories, finished products could not reach military units, food could not reach civilian populations. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who had commanded the submarine I-58 during the war, observed this reality with bitter clarity. The Americans destroyed Japan's capacity to fight not through dramatic fleet actions, but through the patient, methodical severing of our supply lines. While our admirals dreamed of decisive surface engagements, American submarines quietly ensured those engagements could never be decisive, regardless of outcome. The survivors of Yamato's final crew confronted their own complex legacies. Of the approximately 260 men who escaped the sinking vessel, many struggled with what the Japanese call ikinokori no zaisho, the shame of having survived when so many others perished. They formed an association after the war, meeting annually to honor their lost shipmates and to process their shared trauma. Petty Officer Kazuo Shimomura, who had served as a lookout aboard Yamato, described these gatherings with poignant simplicity. "We do not meet to glorify the past or to celebrate war. We meet because only we truly understand what happened. The terror, the courage, the confusion, the loss. We carry the memories of 3,000 men who cannot speak for themselves. This is our burden, but also our privilege. At one such gathering in 1967, an unexpected visitor appeared Robert Ballard, the American oceanographer who would later locate Yamato's wreckage. Though initially greeted with suspicion, Ballard's sincere interest in documenting the ship's final resting place as a historical site rather than a trophy eventually won over the Survivors Association. They shared their recollections, helping him understand the vessel's layout and the circumstances of its sinking. When asked why documenting Yamato's wreckage mattered, Ballard offered a perspective that transcended national boundaries. These ships, these battles, they're not just American or Japanese history. They're human history. They represent both our capacity for destruction and our obligation to remember. Every shipwreck is a tomb, but it's also a classroom where future generations can learn from our mistakes. This philosophy of shared remembrance gradually gained traction as former enemies became allies. In 1954, a joint Japanese-American memorial service was held at sea above the approximate location of Yamato's sinking. Captain James Sauer, who had commanded aircraft from USS Essex that participated in the attack, laid a wreath alongside Captain Tamechi Hara, one of the few senior Japanese naval officers to survive the war. Their handshake, captured by photographers, became a powerful symbol of reconciliation. Yet beneath this public reconciliation, thorny questions remained unresolved. Who bore responsibility for sending thousands of young men to die in hopeless battles? What moral judgment should history render on leaders who continued fighting long after defeat was inevitable? How should nations memorialize conflicts where heroism and atrocity existed side by side? These questions gained particular urgency as the architects of Japan's war effort faced justice at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The Tokyo trials held from May 1946 through November 1948. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had authorized Yamato's final mission, stood among the accused. During his testimony, prosecutors questioned him specifically about the decision to send the battleship on what amounted to a suicide mission. Toyoda's response reflected the tortured logic of Japan's military leadership in the war's final stages. By April 1945, conventional victory was no longer possible. We hoped that by demonstrating our willingness to sacrifice our most precious naval asset, we might convince the Americans that conquering Japan would cost too many lives to be worthwhile. The Yamato mission was less a military operation than a message written in the blood of our finest sailors. The tribunal rejected this rationalization, finding that military necessity could not justify knowingly sending thousands to certain death for purely psychological effect. Toyoda was ultimately acquitted on other grounds, but the moral condemnation of operations like Ten-Go remained. The willingness to expend lives for symbolic purposes represented a fundamental perversion of military ethics, subordination of human value to abstract concepts of national honor. For ordinary Japanese citizens in the post-war era, Yamato's story became a complex symbol of both pride and caution. Pride in the technical achievement it represented a nation with limited industrial capacity, creating the world's largest battleship. Caution about the dangers of military thinking divorced from political reality and human cost. This duality found expression in popular culture. In 1953, composer Hiroshi Miyagawa created Senkan Yamato, Battleship Yamato, a symphonic piece that captured both the majesty of the vessel and the tragedy of its loss. The composition begins with thunderous brass representing Yamato's power, transitions through passages evoking naval warfare, and concludes with a mournful string section suggesting lives lost and lessons learned. 2 decades later, Yamato entered popular culture through an unexpected medium animation. The 1974 television series Space Battleship Yamato, released internationally as Star Blazers, reimagined the sunken warship salvaged and converted into a spacecraft defending Earth from alien threats. This science fiction reinterpretation resonated deeply with Japanese audiences, transforming a symbol of defeat into one of technological redemption. Historian Kentaro Awaya noted the psychological significance of this cultural evolution. By reimagining Yamato as a vessel that saves humanity rather than one that represents failed militarism, the Japanese people found a way to process their complex feelings about the war. The space battleship became a means of acknowledging technical achievement while redirecting it toward peaceful, defensive purposes. For American naval officers studying at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, Yamato's story became a standard case study in technological overinvestment and doctrinal inflexibility. Captain Walter Carrig, who authored the official U.S. Navy History of the Pacific War, emphasized this perspective in his lectures. Yamato represents the danger of optimizing for yesterday's warfare. The Japanese built the ultimate battleship, just as battleships became strategically irrelevant. No amount of armor or gun caliber could compensate for fundamental misconceptions about how the war would be fought. This lesson influenced American naval procurement for decades. When Admiral Hyman Rickover advocated for nuclear propulsion in the 1950s, he explicitly referenced Yamato as a cautionary tale. We must not build magnificent white elephants. Every ship, every weapon system must be evaluated not just on its technical specifications, but on its strategic relevance and adaptability to evolving threats. Similar reflections occurred within the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF, established in 1954 as Japan's post-war navy. Constrained by constitutional limitations on offensive capabilities, the JMSDF developed a philosophy emphasizing quality over quantity, technological sophistication within strict parameters, and integration with allied forces rather than independent operation. Admiral Takeo Hiranuma, one of the JMSDF's founding officers and a former Imperial Navy lieutenant, explicitly contrasted this approach with pre-war thinking. The lesson of Yamato is not that big ships are inherently flawed, but that no military capability exists in isolation. The most powerful weapon is worthless if your strategy is fundamentally unsound, if your logistics cannot sustain operations, or if your intelligence fails to identify the actual threat. This emphasis on balanced capabilities and realistic assessment characterized Japan's broader post-war approach to security. Having experienced the catastrophic consequences of strategic overreach, Japanese leaders embraced a more measured vision of national power, one based on economic strength, technological advancement, and international cooperation rather than military dominance. The shipyards that had once built Yamato transitioned to commercial vessel production, becoming among the world's most efficient and innovative. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which had manufactured Yamato's main battery turrets, redirected its engineering expertise toward peaceful infrastructure, transportation systems, and energy production. These transformations reflected a profound re-evaluation of national priorities. Resources that had once been channeled into weapons development now funded research in electronics, materials science, and manufacturing processes. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 decades of defeat, Japan had become an economic superpower, its products synonymous with quality and innovation. Yoshida Shigeru, who served as Prime Minister during the American occupation and early independence, articulated this shift most clearly. Our pursuit of military greatness led to utter destruction. Our pursuit of economic development has led to unprecedented prosperity. The contrast could not be clearer. Nations thrive not through force of arms, but through productive industry, fair trade, and wise governance. For the families of Yamato's lost crew members, such macro-historical perspectives offered little immediate comfort. In the fishing villages and farming communities that had sent sons to serve aboard the mighty battleship, empty places at family tables represented the war's true cost. No strategic analysis or economic resurgence could fill those spaces. Yuriko Tashima, who lost her husband Seaman Hideo Tashima in Yamato's final battle, to express this personal dimension in an interview conducted in the 1970s. The admirals speak of necessary sacrifices. The historians debate military doctrines. Politicians talk about lessons learned. But for 30 years, I have lived with an empty space beside me where my husband should be. This is the real meaning of war, not sunken ships, but shattered lives that can never be made whole again. Similar sentiments echoed across the Pacific. American families who lost sons to kamikaze attacks, island battles, and submarine warfare experienced the same fundamental reality that beyond strategic outcomes and historical analyses lay the irreplaceable value of individual human lives. This recognition eventually fostered a different kind of reconciliation, not just between governments, but between ordinary citizens who had suffered similar losses on opposite sides of the conflict. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a remarkable gathering took place at Pearl Harbor. Veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy met with their American counterparts in a ceremony emphasizing shared humanity rather than past enmity. Among the participants was Petty Officer Masahiko Tanabe, one of the last surviving crew members from Yamato. Then, in his 80s, Tanabe presented a hand-carved model of the battleship to the Pearl Harbor Museum with these words: "This ship represents both the height of our nation's technical achievement and the depth of our strategic failure. I offer it not in celebration of what Yamato was, but in solemn remembrance of what it cost." The model remains on display today, alongside artifacts from USS Arizona and other vessels destroyed during the war. Together, they tell a story not of national conflict, but of human experience, courage, suffering, loss, and eventual reconciliation. Visitors from both Japan and America stand before these displays, contemplating not just military history, but fundamental questions about how societies choose their paths and bear the consequences of those choices. For naval architects and military planners worldwide, Yamato's legacy extends beyond historical interest to practical application. The battleship's fate demonstrates the dangers of what strategists call platform-centric thinking, the tendency to build military capabilities around specific weapon systems rather than desired outcomes. This insight has influenced defense procurement in ways that continue to evolve. Modern naval construction emphasizes modularity, adaptability, and distributed capabilities rather than concentration of firepower in single platforms. Networks of sensors, unmanned vehicles, and precision weapons have replaced the concept of dominant central vessels. When the United States Navy commissioned USS Zumwalt in 2016, its most advanced destroyer, the vessel displaced less than half of Yamato's tonnage, yet possessed many times its effective combat power through technology, rather than size. Admiral James Richardson, addressing the Naval War College in 2010, framed this evolution explicitly. "We no longer build warships to win battles through individual supremacy, as Yamato was designed to do. We build them as nodes in a network, each contributing specific capabilities to an integrated system. The measure of effectiveness is not how powerful any single platform might be, but how resilient and adaptive the entire force remains under changing conditions." This networked approach to warfare represents perhaps the most significant practical legacy of Yamato's experience, a recognition that no single weapon system, however impressive its specifications, can compensate for strategic miscalculation or doctrinal inflexibility. Military effectiveness emerges not from individual platforms, but from their integration into coherent operational concepts, supported by realistic assessment of both capabilities and limitations. Yet, for all these practical applications, Yamato's most enduring legacy may be philosophical rather than technical. The battleship's story illuminates fundamental truths about how nations make decisions, how organizations resist evidence that contradicts their core assumptions, and how individuals find meaning amid circumstances they cannot control. The Japanese naval officers who conceived Yamato were not fools or incompetents. Many were brilliant engineers, dedicated professionals, and patriotic citizens. Their failure was not one of technical expertise, but of imagination, an inability to recognize that the future would not resemble the past, that new technologies would render old certainties obsolete, that strategic advantage comes not from perfecting existing systems, but from anticipating how warfare itself might change. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The French built the Maginot Line based on experiences from the First World War, only to watch German forces bypass it entirely in 1940. American planners designed nuclear strategies around bomber fleets, then had to rapidly adapt when ballistic missiles changed the strategic calculus. Military organizations naturally optimize for familiar challenges, while often discounting emerging threats that don't match established paradigms. What makes Yamato's story particularly compelling is how completely its experience refuted the assumptions that created it. The battleship designed to win through overwhelming firepower never landed a significant hit on an American capital ship. The vessel meant to dominate surface engagements was destroyed by aircraft beyond the horizon. The ship built to decide the Pacific War in a single decisive battle became instead a floating headquarters, then a transport for troops to Guadalcanal, and finally a desperate sacrifice in a war already lost. For the sailors who served aboard Yamato, these grand strategic miscalculations translated into immediate human realities: cramped quarters, endless drills, monotonous patrols, and ultimately, for most, death in the cold waters south of Japan. Their individual experiences, recorded in diaries, letters, and survivor accounts, reveal men who rarely questioned their assigned role or the strategic context that shaped it. They focused instead on immediate duties, personal relationships, and the small dignities that made military life bearable. Seaman Yukio Kobayashi, who maintained torpedo defense systems aboard Yamato and perished in its sinking, wrote in his final letter home, "We do not know where we are going or when we will return. The officers tell us nothing, and we ask few questions. My responsibility is to my shipmates and to you, my family. I maintain my equipment, I perform my duties, I write these letters. The rest is in the hands of our leaders and the gods." This poignant acceptance of limited agency reflects a universal aspect of military service, the subordination of individual choice to collective purpose. Yet, it also reveals the tremendous moral responsibility that falls on leadership when commanding such dedication. Those who send others into harm's way incur an obligation to ensure that sacrifice serves necessary and achievable objectives, not merely abstract concepts of national honor or institutional prestige. The officers who ordered Yamato's final sortie failed this fundamental test of leadership. They knowingly dispatched thousands of men to certain death not because the mission had any reasonable chance of success, but because institutional momentum and cultural expectations made any other decision unthinkable. The imperative to do something overrode rational assessment of what could actually be achieved. This pattern sacrifice, demanded long after strategic success becomes impossible, characterized Japan's entire approach to the war's final stages. From banzai charges on Pacific islands to kamikaze attacks against Allied shipping to Yamato's doomed mission, Japanese leadership consistently chose symbolic resistance over practical preservation of lives that might rebuild the nation after inevitable defeat. The human cost of this choice was staggering. Beyond the immediate casualties lay long-term trauma that affected survivors, families, and communities for generations. The psychological burden of having participated in hopeless operations, of watching comrades die for objectives that could never be achieved, left wounds that time alone could not heal. Yet from this collective trauma emerged remarkable resilience. The Japan that rose from wartime destruction became a global leader in peaceful industry, technological innovation, and international cooperation. The United States that emerged from the conflict transformed from reluctant participant to architect of a new international order. Former enemies became not just allies but partners in building more prosperous societies than either had known before the war. This transformation offers perhaps the most hopeful aspect of Yamato's legacy, the demonstration that even the most catastrophic failures can serve as foundations for eventual renewal. The recognition of fundamental miscalculation, however painful, creates opportunity for genuine re-evaluation and meaningful change. Today, as naval historians and enthusiasts debate technical details of Yamato's design and operational history, this broader significance sometimes recedes from view. Yet it remains the vessel's most important legacy, a reminder that technological prowess without strategic wisdom leads inevitably to tragedy, that courage and sacrifice in service of flawed objectives represent failure of leadership rather than triumph of spirit, and that true strength lies not in imposing dominance, but in adapting successfully to changing realities. The mighty battleship that now rests in pieces on the seabed stands as both monument and warning, a testament to human ingenuity and ambition, but also to the dangers of institutional rigidity and strategic overreach. Its 18-inch guns, once the most powerful naval weapons on Earth, remain forever silent. Its armoured citadel, designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment, lies broken and scattered. Yet, in its very destruction, Yamato achieved a kind of immortality, becoming not just a footnote in military history, but a powerful symbol of both the heights of human technical achievement and the depths of strategic miscalculation. For those who study military affairs, for those who make decisions sending others into harm's way, for those who allocate finite resources toward competing national priorities, Yamato's story offers an eternal reminder. No weapon, however powerful, can compensate for strategic blindness. No sacrifice, however noble, can redeem fundamental miscalculation. No tradition, however venerable, should override evidence that the world has changed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.